Oh, sorry everyone, it's both freezing and again because I live in California, it's always nearly on fire. Our seasons are really out of whack, much like the book that I just read. What if I took California weather and urban fantasy and combined them? And then you basically get Summer Night by Jim Butcher. Now this is the fourth book in the Dresden Files. Well, we might as well get into the review because I have plenty to say about it. So, Summer Night once again follows the misadventures of Harry Blackstone Copperfield Dresden. This time, his semi-failing detective business is now on the verge of completely collapsing, as Harry's basically become nearly homeless. After the events of grave peril, he's devoted most of his time and attention to help trying to figure out how to stop his ex-girlfriend from becoming a vampire. Harry's basically on the verge of failing, and that unless he starts making money, well, luck might have it when he's basically visited by a fairy queen of winter who gives him an offer he can't refuse. All he has to do is something very simple: investigate a murder and stop an all-out war between wizards and vampires. What could go wrong? For me, when it comes to Summer Night, there are a lot of things that I liked about the book. There's a lot of things that I hated about the book. I think for me, it kind of flip-flops in the narrative. It doesn't know really what it wants to be. Does it want to be more of a detective story or more of a character piece about Harry Dresden and kind of battling his inner demons in many ways? It does have a lot of things that I like about it. It actually is one of my favorite scenes in all of the Dresden Files, but also at the exact same time, it feels a little weird. This is going to sound really weird if I'm going to be using a Dresden Files thing that Harry probably will agree with me about, is that this is the new Coke of the Dresden Files. You take a sip of it, it kind of tastes like the Dresden Files or Coke, but there's something weird and different about it that you can't quite place it. And for me, this is kind of what I felt like when it comes to the story. I might as well explain kind of that weird taste and what I liked about it, what I hated about it. Though I should start with the pros. For me, I think the biggest pro of Summer Night is actually the world building. I think the world building in this really opens up the world. Normally when it comes to the Dresden Files, we normally just see Chicago from its pizzas down to basically it just being the Windy City. But now the world is kind of more opened up. We kind of see it more of a global conflict, both for the supernatural world, but just the world in general, because we're introduced more to things like the White Council and how they're not just a bunch of Gandalf wise wizards with long beards. Nah, a bunch of them are jerks and a bunch of a-holes. And I kind of appreciate that we're kind of seeing more of the world in this way. We're kind of seeing how the stakes have raised a lot, especially when it comes to this, and how a good chunk of this book is devoted to just a giant conventions of wizards at a convention center, and kind of how, the comedy comes from that, but also kind of talk about the serious nature of the things that are happening all across the world, and how Harry is, out of all of them, both not the smartest wizard in the bunch, but also at the exact same time, he has a lot of people that are against him, but he does have people that actually do root for him within that world. For me, I think this world building in this is strong because, again, we're not just tied down to Chicago. That is our focal point. But now that the world is kind of expanding in this way, we can actually see it a lot differently than just it being Chicago. We can actually see the stakes of the world. Another thing that I really liked about this book is actually the characters. For me, I think Jim Butcher, this is where he nails Harry. This is where he nails a lot of wonderful things when it comes to the characters, like with Karen and Billy, and all the people that kind of start to become Harry's support system, because in this book we see Harry as kind of the figure that's depressed. He doesn't really know what to do. He's like, he is his own worst enemy. He basically locks himself up and becomes almost an incel in a way of just, he doesn't care about anything but helping out Susan, trying to figure out, trying to undo his mistake that he did. And for me, I kind of like looking at this. I mean, I don't like that Harry is kind of becoming this sad, depressed person, but we see kind of his fall from grace and how much Harry Dresden, I think one of the biggest things that the Dresden Files does really well is the human character of Harry. His human elements are so real and raw that it's what makes the series. You feel sad for Harry. You want him to succeed. You want him to have that hug almost. Because when it comes to Jim Butcher and how he writes Harry, we normally see him as either being suave, cool, or a jackass. Now we get to see him more as the pathetic person that doesn't have floaties, but someone's trying to throw him a lifeline a little bit. And we see this here. And for me, I really, really do like that a lot. the last thing that I really loved about this book is actually the humor. I think this is the first book to really just embrace the absurdity of the humor of the Dresden Files. The first 3 books are kind of more grounded in the sense of the horror and the aspects of that, whereas this book just plays up the comedy in many ways, especially when it comes to the Americana and the urban fantasy. One of my favorite scenes in this entire book, I'm not going to spoil it, but it involves a Walmart and a plant monster. And this is where some of the most wackiest things ever happen. And I just think about this. For me, I visually think about this, how this would be shot in a cinematic form, and just every way that I can possibly think about it, I just chuckle a little bit just because of how ridiculously silly it is. And from here, the books become more sillier, and especially when it comes to usually through the use of magic, but also using Americana in many ways. And for me, I really do love that about the story. Now, we should kind of get into the cons of the book. Now, for me, one of the biggest cons of this book is the mystery. It's weird to say that when it comes to the Dresden Files, but for me, the mystery of the Dresden Files are not interesting, and out of all of them, this one is the most confusing. It's supposed to be a murder mystery, but Harry is so distracted on the case, people have to remind him to go on it, and you know, there's no such thing as clues, and a lot of the stuff is Harry doesn't really solve the mystery in this other than people telling him how to solve it. And I've read this book in my lifetime 4 or 5 times, and I cannot describe the mystery to you. I'm not sure why it's confusing. Is it because Jim Butcher really wanted to focus on the character stuff rather than the mystery of this book? Or it's just not a good mystery because it's not easy to figure out. And this is more of the plot. You just let this narrative tell you how things are going rather than playing that little game of like, am I going to figure out this mystery before Harry does, and vice versa. I think that's what really makes a good mystery book, is kind of, you know, having those games you get to play, especially when it comes to the mystery and trying to figure things out and kind of be one step ahead of the author in many ways. Here you don't get that. You just let the narrative ride, and I think that's kind of one of the big problems of this book. Another con of this book is I think the plotting of this book is really weird. A lot of the book is devoted to chunks about the convention, and then somewhat of the mystery, and then Harry going off and doing what's this and what's that. And this is one that I feel like the wheels are spinning a little bit, and this feels like a book that was padded out just to meet a deadline. I don't want to say that's a bad thing, but at the exact same time, it's okay to have books that are padded out, but they need to have purpose. I felt like the majority of this book didn't have a purpose to it, other than Harry's sad, and Harry has to go on this investigation because it's gonna, 1, save his business, and 2, it's not gonna get him horribly murdered in many ways, and 3, he just needs something to do in this book. And I feel like, yeah, he does a lot of cool things in the book, but also at the exact same time, the plot is just so weird and flip-floppy in the terms of what it's supposed to do. A lot of it is actiony, a lot of it is character piece stuff, but it doesn't feel like they mesh together, more like they kind of have like, okay, this happens, then this has to happen, and this has to happen. It's almost like a stacking sandwich, but all the ingredients are like mixed and matched in a way that might not make sense. When you take a bite out of it, it does sort of work, but then you forget things like the salt and the pepper and the seasoning, and it just kind of mushes together in a weird sandwich analogy that I'm using. And the last big thing that I didn't like about this book is the villain's plot. Once again, I've read this book 3 or 4 times, and much like the mystery, I cannot tell you what the villain's plot is. I tried writing it down. I don't really want to spoil it, but it's so convoluted. I kind of missed the day of Full Moon with like the Hawks and Wolfen and the evil villain plan of that were just so ambiguous of what they're doing. This is just like, well, if we have this and this and this, it kind of works. But for me, I think it just goes around in circles, and by the end of it, I kept forgetting characters' names. And again, I'm writing notes down for this review and trying to figure out what works about it. And out of all of them, this is the most confusing. Again, you have to let the plot go its way, but I don't think that's kind of the purpose of the story. The stuff that works in this is the character moments with Harry doing his thing and kind of just mingling through the world and pretty much having the world building, him interacting with people. The mystery is the backseat of this, much like him driving around in his Beetle. A lot of the stuff, it's just not front and center. So if you're looking for a good mystery book, out of all of them, this one has probably the worst mystery in all of them. and by the end of it, I'm very indifferent about the book. I didn't necessarily hate this book. I think it has a lot of good highlights. Again, it has one of my favorite scenes in the entire series. It has a lot of good stuff with Harry just being himself and trying to figure out the world, but also at the exact same time, the mystery is lacking. I felt like a lot of the stuff just doesn't go anywhere. There doesn't seem to be any, it just meanders a little bit. And in the end, it does have some touching moments into it. I love the ending of this. I kind of love the whole theme of this is kind of letting go and kind of accepting some of your mistakes and just moving on with your life. Would I recommend it? Not really. It's one of those where it's like, unfortunately, you have to read it if you want to get the whole narrative of the Dresden Files, but it's such an indifferent book for me that normally I skip it, and this is one where I'll go to the next book, which is a much better book, where I'll read Grave Peril, and of all of them, this is probably one of my least read out of all of them, besides Full Moon. This is probably the second least read book out of all of them. Didn't hate it, didn't love it, had some fun parts to it, but it's one of those that for me, I probably won't read it unless I have to read it again, if I'm doing like a whole Harry Dresden marathon. But in the end of the day, I still had fun reading it, but at the exact same time, I'm very indifferent about it, much like the weather of California, I guess, where some days it's hot, some days it rains, and some days we're just on fire and you just have to deal with it. Oh, I guess we're not on fire. See, everything's indifferent. Well, everyone, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you like this video, maybe consider subscribing or giving me a like or a thumbs up. I would really appreciate that. Well, everyone, thank you all so much for watching this video. And like always, may your food and drink ever be tasteful, and may your books be filled with fantasy and adventure. Bye, everyone. See ya.